Welcome, Wargamers, back to the Mortal Realms as we begin to explore Act 1 of Broken Realms Teclis. You see, in our last video we did the prologue, and the lines were drawn in the sand, the forces were set, and the stakes were raised, as Nagash sent an army into Shyish, which was promptly destroyed by Teclis. An ultimatum was given to Nagash to retreat, but this act set in motion a series of spite and hubris-driven events that will have dramatic consequences for the mortal realms. And we pick back up immediately after that interaction between the gods of light and undeath. Assembling an army, Teclis devised an initial assault on Shyish. This force would be known as the Teclian Vanguard, primarily formed of Venari and Alarith. And if you're unfamiliar with the Lumineth Realm Lords, that's basically the elves who don't really have a focus, so they're kind of vanilla elves, so to speak, and those who have studied the powers of the mountain, those are the Alarith. And here was the plan. Okay, we're going to enter Shyish through a hidden realm gate that Teclis knows about, that apparently the Lords of Death within Shyish don't quite know about. And they're going to head over to a place called the Triptych and deal a decisive first punch to the Realm of Death's armies. Now, this place that I mentioned, the Triptych, is very interesting. See, Teclis could have assaulted Gothazar, which is a more important location we know from the lore. It's the home base of Catacross. It's the beating heart of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Because at this point, Catacross, as we know from the Wrath of the Everchosen, my mind just blanked there for a hot second, he's off in the 8 points fighting with Archaon, right? So he's not even home. It's like we could destroy theirs, but he decided against it because he figured the Mortarch of the Necropolis would not have left his home base poorly defended. He's like, no, we're not here for a prolonged siege. We want to just make a point, a big first punch. So instead, Teclis chose to strike at a location which would be just as symbolic as it was strategic. The Triptych, and this was for a few reasons. Firstly, it was a large moat of death magic, which Teclis wanted to seal, demonstrating his ability to repair and dismantle the cursed magics of death that Nagash wields. Secondly, this location was the site of 3 towering fortresses with statues that soared high into the sky, each depicting a great general of Ossia, which was, of course, the region where the Triptych is located and the home of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, with, of course, the largest statue being that of Catacross himself. Toppling these statues would send a message and a challenge that could not be ignored, right? So much arrogance and hubris and self-identity was wrapped up in these edifices that bringing them down would absolutely send a message that rippled throughout all of Shyish. It's a significant blow to the pride of Nagash. Lastly, this was an important passageway that connects the continents of Praetorus and Equus, which, honestly, all you need to know about that is they're 2 important regions, meaning that altogether, it was important, and it would be noticed, and it would hurt. So to get there, to get to this Triptych place, Teclis had devised a scheme. Using the power of stone mages, great slabs of Shyish earth were raised up to the sky, think of these floating monoliths. So, after the Teclian Vanguard made it into Shyish, they load up the entire force onto these massive stones, and they basically just start flying over Shyish, which is crazy, right? There's forts all along the route that they're taking, and they're just looking up and seeing these huge monolithic rocks in the sky, and they can't really do a whole lot about it. Most of the weapons that the Ossiarchs have don't reach that high, and any flying units they send just get blasted with magic as soon as they're near. And I have to imagine that this very public and visible entry is just another way of Teclis showing off, right? Rubbing in Nagash's face look what I can do. You can't even touch me. And as these stones are traveling deeper and deeper, the towering fortresses and statues of the Triptych come into view. Now again, this was supposed to be a simple job. Run in, smash something Nagash holds dear. But much like his opponent Nagash, Teclis underestimated the situation. As these monoliths floated close enough for the Lumineth magics to be fired upon, meaning they can actually shoot the actual fortification beneath them, the Ossiarch Bone Reaper forces on the ground began to chant, specifically those of the Mortisan Bone Shapers. And in their arrogance, the elves thought, well, we're well protected from any magics they could fire at us, right? We have the mage god at our back. He's shutting down magic. We're way up high. They can't shoot us. We're fine. But that began to change as the statue of Catacros, which was affixed to the top of the tallest fort here, began to move and shift. Because the Ossiarch Bone Reapers here, again, this is a huge fort. There's a huge army here down below. They realized they couldn't touch the Teclian Guard because they were flying so high up in the sky. But masters of bone shaping and reanimation, they poured life into the Catacros statue, turning it into a devastating titan. And wielding his nullstone glaive, again, this is all meant to be ornamental, but they're bringing it to life. The statue swatted the monoliths out of the sky, carrying the Lumineth Realm Lords. And soon, this grand army that was like so imposing and looked so perfect and regal and was so sure of themselves, chuckling, now they're falling to the ground. And with this single mistake at the start of their offensive, the Lumineth assault was brought to a halt, because now the fight would not be solely on the terms dictated by Teclis. Now, between the Stone Mages, Teclis, and Salinar, the vast majority of the Lumineth Realm Lords were brought down to the ground somewhat safely, right? They were all shaken and in disarray, but they weren't like insta-killed by these rocks dropping from the sky. But they didn't even have time to reform their ranks before the first Mortek Guard had reached them. Remember, they essentially crash-landed at the base of a huge fortress, and Catacros, ever the planner, had set up defenses for it even though he's gone. So there's like a full Ossiarch Bone Reaper army here. However, with the way that these stone monoliths had landed, an opportunity presented itself. See, thinking quickly, the Stone Mages raised large portions of the rock up into the sky to form these crude fortifications, or at least a more defensible location. And the raised edges of the rock gave the Lumineth a bit of a high ground advantage. But that relief was short-lived as the Mortek Guard advanced in perfect shield wall formations, followed by Mortisan Bone Shapers. Because they were moving in this perfect lockstep, the Mortek Guard stopped at the base of this ledge and began to kind of make their own scaffolding. They would hold their shields up high, form a little bit of a ramp, and then the Bone Shapers would seal their joints together. Again, this is like magic in action, right? I love this aspect of the Bone Reapers because they use bone as clay and they just like locked them in, and so this living ramp. And with this ramp established, what should come bounding over the rock wall directly into the Lumineth defense line but a swath of Necropolis stalkers. These are the four-headed, blade-wielding maniac type of Ossiarch Bone Reapers that are all offense all the time. And the description of the carnage here is crazy. They're just mowing through wardens, right? These are the Lumineth units, and even the defensive power of the Stone Guard are struggling to keep up. Now, this position that he got himself into, Teclis understood, was a losing fight, right? He didn't bring a grand army to fight the Ossiarch Bone Reapers through attrition. He was just trying to send a message, and this was threatened to fail. The Stone Guard, those are the Alarith focused on, meditating at the mountains and that kind of stuff, were able to match the Stalkers blow for blow, but it wasn't until the second rank of Stone Guard, armed with their diamond-tipped hammers, actually started making headway, right? They needed the piercing effect to make it through the tough exoskeleton of the Stalkers. And not only that, there was a daring counterattack unleashed by the Lumineth. A huge charge of Dawn Riders who were kept in the rear towards, the back end of this engagement were finally unleashed. And while the Mortek Guard formed a shield wall that would have seen any lesser cavalry or even like wild beasts be shattered, the Dawn Riders were something different, because brilliant Hish light gleamed from their weapons as they met the charge. And so basically it's an impact hit from their horses, but also a magic blast unleashed at the exact same time. So they're cutting through Mortek lines like knives through butter. And the point that I really want you to kind of get away from here, rather than just kind of going beat by beat by beat, is that the For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction from the enemy, right? The Mortek Guard do X and the Lumineth reply with Y. And then it's just they keep going back and forth, seizing the inertia of battle. Someone's always taking the advantage from somebody else. The Dawn Rider charge is just the latest example of that. However, that changes with the whistling that comes from the sky. And this whistle is followed by a titanic explosion. The Mortek crawlers had finally been aimed and loaded. The use of artillery would threaten to dramatically change the nature of this offensive. Remember, they're sitting at the bottom of a giant fort that's loaded to the gills with artillery that has now finally been wheeled over and aimed properly. So Teclis' idea of staying in place with his little, semi-defensive structure and just doing these great little hit and run things to kind of drain the army of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers dry was no longer an option. And at this point, the text really expresses something that affects the battle, and that is the power of insults. Meaning, Teclis had brought this grand army into Shyish and dared to set up a fortification. Right, it's an improvised one, but the Stone Mages did make their own little patch of dirt in Shyish with this rock fort that they're trying to build mid-battle. And that's an insult to the Great Necromancer that cannot go unanswered, right? How dare you establish your own little pocket of anything in Shyish? So, the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, even though they have the advantage, right? They have the resources to just stay there and grind out the army and the artillery. Even though they have all this and they would win given enough time, they responded to the insult rather than the tactical threat. And what I mean by that is, these 3 big fortifications, all their troops came out. Okay, they were all half-manned, and the Ossiarch Bone Reapers began to flood towards the Lumineth, and in truth, this was an overreaction. Too many units had poured out of the fortifications, responding, like I said, in anger and disgust that somebody would dare step foot in Shyish, rather than the tactical decision, which was just stay in the frickin' fort. Just stay in the fort and use the artillery. And this overreaction left a gap in their defenses. You see, to the east, a glow erupted on the horizon, and it kept growing larger. Now, as the generals of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers watched, thinking maybe it's a band of Nighthaunt, I don't really know, it became very clear. There was a third great stone monolith raised from the ground. The third tip to the Teclis spear, and ultimately the doom of the triptych. Because on this monolith were all of the Alarith Spirit of the Mountains. Those are the big rock edifices that look like cows, basically. All of those things were on this last spear tip. And when this monolith landed safely at the feet of the eastern flank, there were precious few Ossiarch Bone Reapers ready to meet them, because again, they had overextended. They were flooding all over the place to get the initial assault because they were insulted. They weren't thinking. And so the Alarith, the spirits of these mountains and their world hammers set to work. And like lumberjacks in the woods, these stone avatars swung wildly at the towering fortresses. The first fell, and then the second. Now at this point, Teclis, who had spent most of the battle shutting down the magics of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, was free to focus his attention on destruction. Apparently he was playing a very defensive role, right? He was making sure his stone monoliths landed safely, so all of his elves didn't die instantly. And then there were so many wizards in the Ossiarch Bone Reaper army hurling magics at them. He was shutting all that down and acting very defensive, but now everything's in disarray. A bunch of the leaders are dead. Now he can focus on being an active participant. And the mage god himself personally brought down the tower with the statue of Catacrosa on it. Searing beams of light magic cut through the bone and obsidian of any Ossiarch that were nearby. And he even tapped into the bone shapers attempting to repair or animate it. Meaning if he shot an Ossiarch Bone Reaper or the tower while there was a Mortisan trying to repair it, there was some kind of feedback that would kill them as well. So it's like a twofer, right? You're shooting the infantry, but at the same time, you're also killing off all of the leaders and all of the support who are trying to keep that infantry going. And now, bereft of leadership and authority, the Ossiarch Bone Reaper lines began to fall apart. Their inertia had been spent when they all depleted the towers and just ran headlong at the Lumineth. Now they had a fight on multiple flanks. Their catapults were in the fortress that were just crumbled, and the day was lost. The last of the Bone Reapers faded into dust was actually Volkmortian himself, a named character from the book. And he issued one last offer to Teclis to stop. He's like, you don't have to keep going. And Teclis was like, no dice, and just basically made Volkmortian fade away into black sand. And with this, our Lumineth Realm Lord heroes have their first victory, actually one of the first victories in Shyish in a long time, albeit an extremely costly one. Teclis does exactly what he intended to do. He summons a whole collection of runes upon the earth, and the darkening blight of Nagash's magics is peeled away. And that's where we're going to call the story for the day. And we're going to jump right into why is this so cool. I made the comment in my last video that this story is about two egos failing at each other harder than the other, right? Nagash is a fool for marching on Hysh without really being ready for a counter-assault. Teclis' counter-assault underestimated the Ossiarch Bone Reaper presence, and we've already had two armies essentially be destroyed, the Nighthaunt army that walked into Hysh, and the Ossiarch Bone Reaper army here, as well as a ton of Lumineth died in this fight. Again, these are just these two gods underestimating each other all the time. Nagash has lost both of these engagements, but both of these personalities, Teclis and Nagash, have made huge errors in their opening acts of war. And it's interesting in a number of ways. First up is the mission, right? Normally, when we read these campaign books, there's a really well-defined, almost tangible goal, right? The Realm Gate Wars was about, wait for it, Realm Gates. Marching on the 8 points was the whole point of Wrath of the Everchosen. Godhood was the goal of Broken Realms and Morathi. But this is a different book in that Teclis' real goal, so he says, is to send a message. He claims that it's a message of hope to restore the realms, including Shyish, to a place of peace and harmony, whether people want it to be that way or not. In choosing his target, the triptych, and a few other locations that we'll cover tomorrow, it's not really about straightforward military gains. It's not about claiming or conquering territory like we've seen in other books. It's about giving Nagash the middle finger, right? Drawing out and playing upon his emotions and his arrogance, which, keep in mind, Nagash thinks he's all above it, even though he kind of acts like a slave to his emotions sometimes. So I think it's made for a very interesting way to start a war, and very different to the ones we've seen in these other books. Not aiming for the most militarily vital target, but one that hurts the opponent in their sense of superiority, which of course in this case is Ossia, the beating heart of Shyish, and the endless war machine of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers is the goal, right? It's the homeland of the champion Catacros. For an enemy to stand on this soil is unthinkable, and a show of strength that I wager even Nagash was not expecting. We don't often in these books get a lot of battles where the point is not the battle itself, but the act of going against an enemy just to send a message. But again, we're talking about two characters, Teclis and Nagash, whose egos make up the vast majority of their lore, right? Whether that's their hubris in making the same mistakes over and over and over again, like the Black Pyramid in Nagash, or being right but doing everything the wrong way, like is basically the history of Teclis. And there's one thing I wanted to end the video on talking about, and that's something I just didn't pick up before, and that is the magics of Shyish corrupting things, right? I mean, it's whenever I think of Shyish, right, I'm like, oh yeah, it's Shyish, Realm of Death. Of course everything is, dark and deathly, but the truth is, it's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be a place of afterlives, paradises and hells, and all these little sub-worlds that live in harmony with people who may or may not be living mortals there. But the influence of Nagash, the Great Necromancer, and his Black Pyramid, the Shyish Nadir, a central point where all death magic is funneled, has changed all of that. Nagash claims to be, the god of death and that all things will eventually be his, but he's also simultaneously a corrupting presence. Because even if everything is meant to die at some point, it's meant to have a natural life cycle before that end, and Nagash is twisting the realms and breaking that natural order. And I just point that out because I don't often think of, death magic or Shyish as being this corrupting power in the same way that, say, the Chaos Gods are. And of course, while it's not exactly the same, the similarity of breaking the natural order is. And that's precisely what Teclis is here to fix. The book states multiple times that Teclis is not here to conquer Shyish, it's not something he's interested in. Instead, he came to show Nagash that he cannot simply walk over the other realms, and show the spirits and the living people of Shyish what their realm was supposed to be like. This is what Shyish is meant to be, in the hopes that he can inspire equal parts, hope in that Shyish can be different, and rage about what Nagash has done to it. So it's all very like in the heads of these two combatants, right? Where I feel like Broken Realms Morathi was about Morathi getting what she wants. This is much more about the ego of two very important characters in the Mortal Realms and how they're basically being wrong at each other, but like who can be wrong harder. And it's very entertaining. Because even though I'm reading, battles, very specific battles about, this force came from the east, and, all those kinds of things. It depicts a specific battle. Dripping throughout the pages is also this meta-narrative of these two personalities that can't fathom any other way of looking at the world. And I just find that absolutely fascinating. So friends, tell me your thoughts on our story thus far. I would love to hear it. Who are you rooting for? Again, I always want to know as we go through this entire week, I want to know who your money is on until we reach the conclusion. But thank you so much for watching and listening, and I hope to catch you in tomorrow's video. Happy wargaming.